Peace and blessings, family. Peace and blessings, peace and blessings. So, Marina here, and what I would like to do over the next couple of videos is share my journey in writing my first book of poetry entitled If I Decide to Fly, collected poems of affirmation and celebration for African American men. A lot of times as authors, we don't get to tell the backstory of how our work came into fruition. And one of the things I personally like to do is whenever I have an opportunity to talk to a fellow author, I like to get the backstory as to how a particular book or story came into fruition. And so I decided that I would give you an opportunity to hear from the author's perspective of how my book came into fruition. I'm going to share my poems with you and talk about each one and talk about my journey writing each poem. A lot has changed for me in terms of my growth and my development and my journey on my spiritual walk. And so some of the poems will be reflective of where I was at a particular time in my life. Compliments nature, compliments of the roosters crowing in the background. So what I'd like to do over the next couple of videos, like I said, is to share my personal journey, my story of how the book came into fruition, share some of the poems with you. I don't know if I'm going to do every one, but I will share some of the poems with you and talk about, each poem. Cool? So I'm going to start this video just talking about the story, the backstory to my book. I've always been a writer. I remember writing my first story when I was probably about 5 years old, and I wrote a full-length play. Honestly, a full-length play. And I actually still have that full-length play that I wrote. My mom was able to salvage it somehow, I don't know how. But anyway, I've always been a writer. I've always loved the art of writing. And I really didn't discover the love of poetry until I was in high school. And one of my teachers introduced me to Robert Frost and Miles to Go Before I Sleep. And there are parts of that poem that I can still recite today. So I fell in love with poetry in high school and didn't really know much about poetry prior to that. Didn't know much about Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, Langston Hughes. Just didn't really know a lot about poetry. And so this teacher introduced me to Robert Frost, and it was a go from there. I mean, I literally fell in love with poetry. I didn't start dabbling into writing my own poetry until I was in college. But even though I like to write, poetry wasn't an art form that I dabbled a lot into until I went to college. So fast forward anyway, this book came about as a result of the birth of my son. When I had my son, I actually had a near-death experience. Seeing the light and all of that. Life-changing, as most people say who've had a near-death experience. Yet, even through that, I knew that there was something special about having birthed a son. Not to take away from having birth, because Monet, not to take away from having birthed a daughter, but there was something different about having birthed a son. My son's name is Jamani. And so having had the near-death experience and just experiencing a whole different energy with his birth, I wanted to find a poem that could articulate what I felt as a mother having given birth to a son. So I set out to find a poem. I went to the library, y'all. I did all kinds of research, just trying to find something that talked about the joy of having a black, or let me say it this way, a Nubian son. And I think I searched for probably a couple of months, and I could not find anything in particular that articulated it the way I felt it. So you know what I said? I'm a writer. Why don't I write a poem? I'm going to attempt to write a poem. So I sat down, I remember this like it were yesterday. I promise you, I remember this like it were yesterday. I used to work at IBM, and I was sitting at my desk, and I remember pulling out some paper and starting to write a poem. And I can't remember which poem came through first, but I remember writing a poem, writing it from beginning to end. Poem came through. 2 poems came through. 3 poems came through. 4. And before you know it, I would say over a week span, and I may be even generous in saying a week span, sometimes I can remember it as even just a day or 2, I had 52 poems. 52 poems, you all, just spewed out of my spirit. Just came forth out of my spirit as if they had been sitting there waiting for me to birth them. And so I remember writing these poems and, not quite sure what to do with it, not quite sure where to go. Did I want to publish it? Did I want to, I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I was just so excited to have all this new material come forth out of my spirit. And it was actually the first time I had written a collection. I had dabbled in short stories, and I don't know if I had started my novel. I think I had started my novel even back then, but I had never had a collection of work that I knew anything about what to do with. So at some point, fast forward, at some point I decided that I was going to publish it. And I think the first publication I did was probably going to some place like Staples. It wasn't Staples back then, but going to some place like Staples or Michael's and putting together, a little booklet. And that was my first dabble. These wasps trying to get at me. That was my first dabble at attempting to publish my book. And I do want to add this part to it. And then after this, I'll go into my next video talking about sharing a little bit more about the book. But I remember, this is why it's so important to hold on to your dream and not let anybody take your insight or your vision from you. I remember going to, and I had the opportunity to meet Hakam Madhubuti. And at the time, and if you don't know who Hakam Madhubuti is, please look him up. If you Google Hakam Madhubuti, you'll find Hakam Madhubuti. So I don't know how I got an opportunity to meet Hakam Madhubuti, but during that time when I lived in DC, I used to travel in a circle of people that knew Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Cornel West. So I had an opportunity, Ian Levenzant. I had an opportunity to actually perform, I would say open, for some of these big name, wise gurus in our community. And I remember going to Hakam Madhubuti and talking to him about my poem and my book. And at the time, the book was called In Celebration of You, Black Man. In Celebration of You, Black Man. And I remember Hakam Madhubuti saying to me, you'll have to change the title. That title will never sell. That was the first advice he had for me. He didn't say good work. He didn't say I don't like your poetry. He didn't say anything. The first thing he said to me was the title. You have to change the title. It'll never sell. And I was like, okay, all right, I appreciate your advice. But I have to admit, I was a bit discouraged after that. And I think I may have tabled the book for a while and didn't do much with it after that. But then it came back. It would not let me leave it alone. It would not let me leave it at all. And I'm grateful for that. This is not to down Hakam Madhubuti, because I actually love Hakam Madhubuti. One of his poems is one of my favorite poems. But this is just to say, sometimes when people can't see your vision and when they can't see your dream, you have to be the owner of that. Because if you're not, and they give you something that might be contrary to how you feel, it might have a tendency to squelch you, if you don't have the confidence in yourself. And at that time, honestly, I really didn't have the confidence in myself to move forward with publishing this book. So in my next video, I'll talk about the publishing process and I'll share with you some of my poetry. Okay? Thank you. Peace.